Good morning, everyone, distinguished participants, to the organizing committee and the hosts and the partners and the supporters that invited me this morning. I appreciate the honor of being here at Iwater. Thank you in advance to the translators in the back who have a much more difficult job than I do. Water is on everybody's mind. We hear about problems every day, from droughts to floods to conflict over water to scarcity to contamination to climate change. And there's plenty of bad news. And we all are familiar with the bad news. But I also believe that the future is a positive one, and that we are moving ultimately toward a much more sustainable future, especially for water. And I think we're in a transition now from the bad news of today to what I hope will be the good news of tomorrow. And my talk this morning is going to be in three parts. I'm going to talk about the three ages of water, the history of water, how we got to where we are today. I'm going to talk about some new challenges that face us, and I'm going to talk about solutions that will move us into this more positive future. The first age of water began 100,000 years ago at the dawn of civilization, when life was very simple and unpleasant. And humans took water from the environment and they used it and they put wastes back in the rivers, and that was the end of it. And life was pretty short and it was pretty brutish anyway. The second age of water began in the earliest parts of civilization in ancient Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, when society began to outgrow small villages and cities began to form, when we needed, for the first time, irrigated agriculture to feed growing populations. And it expanded in the cities of ancient Rome and ancient Greece, when we learned for the first time how to move water large distances from where we had it to where we needed it, where advances in engineering permitted us to satisfy the demands of growing cities. This is the acequia from Granada, an example in early Spain of some of these large engineering projects. But the second age of water really began to flower in the 1700s and the 1800s. The Renaissance included not just a blossoming of art and music, but also natural philosophy, what we think of today as the natural sciences, the fields of medicine and astronomy and biology and physics, and, I would argue, water resources. Why? By the 1800s, we had very severe, very clear problems associated with water. The English poet Coleridge visited the city of Cologne in 1828, and he wrote a poem about water that described how the city of Cologne took its water and the River Rhine washed the city clean, but humans were dumping wastes into the river and contaminating it. And this was a time in the middle of the 1800s, in 1850, when the Parliament in Great Britain had to shut down during the summer because the River Thames was so badly contaminated they couldn't stand the smell. We had more and more experiences of contaminated rivers and bad health associated with bad water resources. And it led, as I've described, to advances in engineering and to the realization that we had to apply these advances to water resources around the world. And it was more than just a bad smell. At the time, the failure to provide clean water led to bad things. It led to cholera and dysentery and typhoid and the water-related diseases that came with the failure to provide safe water and sanitation. And in the 1850s and 1860s, thousands, tens of thousands of people died every year from water-related diseases in the major cities in London and in Paris and in Barcelona. Barcelona was struck by some of these waves of cholera, first in 1854, again in 1868. Both times, cholera brought to Barcelona in ships coming from Marseille, which was another city that was suffering severe cholera outbreaks. And all of these problems, contamination, water-related diseases, droughts, severe events, led to efforts to address water in a much more direct fashion. We created the first machines to provide water supply. We created the first physical and chemical and biological treatment of contaminated water. We built the first large dams for flood protection and for drought relief, and ultimately for the generation of hydroelectricity. We built aqueducts not tens of kilometers long, but hundreds of kilometers long. And we learned how to move water over mountains and ultimately through mountains. We built the first large-scale irrigation systems that permitted the world to feed 7 billion people. We eliminated cholera and typhoid and dysentery and water-related diseases in the richer countries of the world because we built the technology to purify and deliver safe water to everyone. And all of us grew up in the second age of water. That's the age we were born and raised in. And we assume that when we turn on our taps, safe, affordable water will come out of them. And we've all benefited from the second age of water, and we're still living in it. And today, our smart machines are finding water on other planets. This is a photograph put together from the Mars orbiter that shows literally what turns out to be running water on the surface of Mars. We've discovered water on Enceladus, one of the moons of Saturn. We've discovered water in other galaxies with the smart machines that we've sent to outer space. And the truth is, we take almost all of this for granted. We assume that this is the way it's always been and this is the way it always will be. But the reality is, as we enter the 21st century, things are changing again. And we have not solved all of our water problems, and we should not be taking our water for granted. I would argue that water is once again taking center stage as one of the most critical resource issues facing humanity. Why is that? In part because despite the advances of the second age of water, we have not solved all of our water problems. I live in California. We have a severe drought in California. We're in the 5th year of drought. This was a political cartoon that recently we had after the discovery of water on Mars in the context of the California water problem. Here are some of the challenges that we have not yet solved. First of all, we have water quality problems in different forms, in different places. This is a photograph of the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. This was a very critical event for United States environmental policy. In 1969, the Cuyahoga River caught fire. Now, it turned out it also caught fire in 1952 and various other years. But in 1969, the United States was undergoing an environmental awakening. We had a severe fire in the Cuyahoga River. We had a severe oil spill in 1969 off the California coast. And these events led to some of the major water quality laws in the United States, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act. It led to the Clean Air Act. This was part of the environmental awakening of the Second Age, when we realized we had to do more to protect the environment. And Time magazine described the Cuyahoga River as a river, quote, that oozes rather than flows, and in which a person does not drown, but decays. And yet, in 2014, we had a fire on the James River in Virginia. This was an oil spill carrying oil from one part of the United States to another. We have the shutdown of the water supply system in Toledo, Ohio on Lake Erie because of an outbreak of toxic algae. We had the shutdown of another water supply in West Virginia because of contamination of chemical spills. And most of you are aware of the recent problems in Flint, Michigan, where we had lead contamination that affected a very poor community, and a problem that is still going on. Despite the second age of water, despite the advances, the technological advances, the engineering advances, we have not solved all of our water problems. A second problem that we face is food production. As I mentioned, the second age involved the development and the expansion of irrigated agriculture that permits us to feed 7 billion people today. Food requires water, it requires land, and as populations continue to grow, we are seeing increasing challenges of meeting the food demands of a growing population. Many of our water problems revolve around the way we have chosen to build our agricultural systems. The water contamination associated with agricultural chemicals, the old-style irrigation technologies, the old-style management approaches for irrigated agriculture, and the laws that we've put in place to deal with it. And unless we figure out how to grow more food with less water, food is going to be a major problem in the next few years. A third challenge is that despite the advances of the second age of water, we have failed to deal with natural ecosystems. In part, in the second age of water, we developed water systems, we developed irrigated agriculture, we developed sophisticated water treatment, we learned how to provide water for growing populations, but we ignored the environment. We did not understand, or we did not care in the second age of water about the environmental impacts of our water use. And if there is one major failure of the second age of water, I would argue it's this failure to integrate ecosystems into our water planning and management. The Aral Sea, which has now disappeared, the Nile, the Yellow River, the Colorado River, all of these rivers that no longer reach their deltas are examples of the environmental challenges associated with the failures of the second age of water. And I think all of us can point to a local stream or a local river or a local lake that still today remains badly contaminated. And a piece of this problem, a piece of the environmental problem, is the issue of climate change. Perhaps the greatest human disruption of the environment is the changing climate. And the changing climate is a water problem. The hydrologic cycle, evaporation, condensation, the formation of clouds, condensation, precipitation, runoff, that's the hydrologic cycle, and it is also the climate problem. And as we change the climate, we will be fundamentally changing the hydrologic cycle. The amount of water we get, the demand for water, where the water comes, extreme events in terms of storms, floods, and droughts. And the reality is we've waited too long to act. Many of the recent extreme events that we've seen worldwide, the serious droughts, the serious floods, the typhoons in the Pacific, are all examples of the growing influence of climate change on our system, on our water resources, and on our weather. The drought in California, now 5 years long, has been influenced by climate change, by changes in the Arctic that change storm patterns in the Pacific, by higher temperatures that changes the demand for water, by agriculture and the loss of water off of our reservoirs. Those are all examples of the influence of climate change on extreme events. And we're going to see more and more of that. And this is not new. This is a quote from a book by Roger Revelle and Paul Wagner. In 1990, which is many, many decades ago, governments at all levels should reevaluate legal, technical, and economic procedures for managing water resources in the light of climate changes that are highly likely. We've known for decades that climate change was going to affect our water resources, and yet we've waited too long to act. Fourth, water and politics makes a volatile combination. Competition for water is growing. There's a long history of conflicts over water that goes back thousands of years to ancient Mesopotamia. And in recent years, we've seen attacks on water systems. We've seen conflicts over access to water. The risk of conflict over water is growing. Fifth, and perhaps most important, populations are growing, and we're failing to meet basic human needs for water. There are still 700 million people that don't have access to safe drinking water. There are 2.4 billion people that don't have access to adequate sanitation services. And it's the 21st century. How is it possible, given the advances of the second age of water, that we have failed to meet basic human needs for everyone on the planet? And the failure to meet basic needs for water and sanitation for everyone on the planet leads to bad things. It leads to cholera and dysentery and schistosomiasis and guinea worm, the water-related diseases that those of us in the developed world no longer suffer from. We have a long way to go to meet basic human needs for water. Some of these problems, water quality, climate change, access to safe water, contamination, ecosystem needs, can be solved with the same tools that we used in the second age of water, with the same technologies and the same institutions and the same economic approaches. But I would like to argue that that's not enough. That the things we did in the second age of water will not solve the problems that remain. We need some new thinking. We need new approaches. Some of the problems that we face are fundamentally different. Absolute scarcity. We're running up against absolute limits on water resources. In California, building another dam is not going to solve our problems. We're already taking too much water out of the natural ecosystems. We're already over-pumping water from our groundwater. And the traditional approaches are not going to be a solution. Climate change requires new thinking. It requires thinking not just about water, but about energy. The good news is, I think we're in a transition. I think we're moving from the second age of water to the third age of water, an age that I believe will mean true sustainability. I think we're going to solve all of our water problems, but it's going to require some new thinking and some new ideas. And so for the last part of my talk, let me talk about these new solutions. Let me talk about what I see for the third age of water and offer a positive vision for the future. I think there's a lot of good news out there. I think we live in a period of time where there are smart, innovative people doing smart, innovative things every day. And there are success stories in all of the work that you're doing that are moving us to this third age of water. And let me talk about components of that. First of all, there is a human right to water. The UN declared a human right to water in 2010, and part of the human right to water means providing 100% of the world's population with safe water and sanitation. It's part of the new Sustainable Development Goals. We had the Millennium Development Goals from the year 2000 to the year 2015, and we made advances. And in 2015, we adopted the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, and one of those goals is 100% coverage of safe water and sanitation for everyone on the planet to meet this human right to water. California passed a law acknowledging the human right to water. Part of the new solution is smarter economics, using proper pricing, as some of the earlier speakers mentioned, perhaps using innovative water markets and water transfers. So smarter economics is part of this positive vision for the future. But there's also, I would argue, an ecosystem right to water. And part of the sustainable vision for the future has to mean ecosystem restoration. This is a photograph of a major dam in Washington State in the Pacific Northwest in the United States called the Agua Dam. 2 or 3 years ago, this dam was removed. It produced a little bit of hydroelectricity. It produced no water supply. It was an old dam that needed renovation, and a decision was made to remove this dam and to restore the Agua River. And this is what the river looks like today, just 2 years later. And we now have salmon that are going back to ancient spawning grounds, and the salmon run is being restored. In the United States, nearly 1,000 dams have been removed, mostly small dams, but increasingly large dams, to promote ecosystem restoration on some of our major rivers. We are learning how to restore flows to the deltas of some of the rivers that have dried up in the past. And there are examples around the world of ecosystem restoration. I think part of this new vision is a fundamental shift from thinking about water supply to thinking about water demand. In an era where we're running out of water, where we're running up against absolute peak water limits to availability, we have to think about how we use water as a new part of our water strategy. And part of that is the way we use water at home. Part of it is measuring and metering all of our water use. Part of it is smart appliances that do the things we want with less water. Part of it is changing outdoor landscaping so that we're not wasting incredibly high valuable potable water on outdoor landscapes that don't require potable water. Part of it is changing the way we irrigate our gardens and moving from lawns to drought-resistant gardens. I don't have any lawn at my home in California. I got rid of my lawn. I have a beautiful garden, and I use half the water that the average Californian uses. I have an efficient washing machine. I have an efficient dishwasher, and I can continue, I know, to cut my water use even farther. But part of this issue of demand is also how we grow food. We can grow much more food with much less water. And around the world, we see examples of improving irrigation efficiency and smart soil moisture monitors and different crop types that require less water to grow the food and the fiber that we need. But part of this is also rethinking what we mean by supply. I mentioned that I don't think building another dam in California is going to solve any of our water supply problems, because there's no more water to fill a new dam in California. But there are new supply options that are available to us. And we need to think about supply in a different way. One of those options, is again, some of our earlier speakers mentioned, is the enormous amount of water that we already capture as wastewater and we treat to a very high standard, and then often we throw away. We can no longer think about wastewater as a liability. We have to think about wastewater as an asset. And there are, again, many examples here in Spain, in California, in Israel, and many parts of the world where wastewater is increasingly being treated and put to use. This is the Orange County Groundwater Replenishment District. It's an example in Southern California where we take treated wastewater, we treat it to a high standard, and we recharge groundwater with it. That groundwater is sometimes later pumped up and treated again for potable use or for non-potable use. And increasingly, more and more of our wastewater is being put to use around the world. And that's a new source of supply, potentially an enormous source of supply. Another new source of supply is desalination. Very expensive, it has environmental challenges, but in places around the world, including in Spain and in Barcelona, we see more examples of high quality desalinated water being used for high quality urban demand. And that's a new potential source of supply. Stormwater capture. Increasingly, we're learning how to capture and reuse stormwater rather than capture stormwater and get rid of it as quickly as possible, which is what much of our old infrastructure was designed to do. So let me go back to climate change for one moment. Climate change means a fundamental shift in the way we deal with almost everything. It's going to change the way we operate, the systems that we built over the last century that were designed for a stable climate. We're going to have to change the way we operate our dams and our reservoirs. We're going to have to think about how to manage snowpack that's disappearing. We're going to have to think about how we're going to manage demands for water in a much hotter climate. We're going to have to think about the connection between our water systems and our energy systems. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to produce and use the water that we demand. And desalination is a good example of that. Desalination is a very energy-intensive system. If we're going to move to more desalination, we had better start thinking about the energy implications and the greenhouse gas implications of the energy requirements of whatever we choose to do for water. In California, we move water 1,000 kilometers, and it takes a tremendous amount of energy to do that. The December agreement last December in Paris was a step in the right direction. The negotiations now in Morocco to implement the Paris Agreement are a tremendous step in the right direction. But we're going to have to move faster and faster to avoid more and more severe impacts of climate change. Finally, we have to rethink our institutions. Nelson Mandela said, referring interestingly enough to water management, "It is one thing to find fault with an existing institution. It is another thing altogether, a more difficult task, to replace it with an approach that is better." And yet, that's exactly what we have to do. We have to change the way we educate our students and our future water experts. We have to change the way we manage water, not just water alone, but water and energy, water and food, water and climate. As individuals, we have a responsibility. The things we choose to eat affect the amount of water that agriculture demands. Meat-intensive diets are water-intensive diets. We have to think about the way we use water in our homes and in our industries. Politics is a fundamental part of water resources. Ironically, we fight over water more and more, and yet we have to manage water from a political point of view in a better way, and we have to learn the tools of water diplomacy. We have to develop agreements on international river basins where we have no international agreements, including, for example, the rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates, ancient Mesopotamia, which today are a source of much of the water conflict around the world in Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. So let me close with one more big piece of the puzzle. The demand for water has always been assumed to be tied to population growth. More people, bigger economies, more demand for water. And that assumption has driven in the second age of water much of our policy and planning. The assumption that a bigger population would mean more demand for water meant we built more and more hard infrastructure. And that was an important part of the second age of water. But I would like to argue that that assumption is no longer true. And let me close with this graph. And let me explain this graph. This is a graph of the gross domestic product of the United States, a measure of the economy of the United States, from the year 1900 to the year 2010. And it shows what every economist loves to see, and that's exponential growth in our economy. And we don't necessarily have to get into a conversation about whether exponential growth forever is an appropriate thing. But that's the assumption that economists make. And the other thing this graph shows is the total use of water in the United States. Water for everything. Water for power plant cooling and irrigation and home use and landscapes and industry in the blue line. And it shows that those two curves rose together up until about 1980. And when I went to school and I was taught economics and I was taught hydrology, I was taught that as our economy grows and our population grows, the demand for water will grow, and I'd better learn how to build a dam. And I have an engineering degree, and I don't really know how to build a dam. But that was the assumption that was made. And yet, in 1980, we fundamentally broke those two curves apart. And in the United States today, and in California, and in Los Angeles, and in San Francisco, and in many other parts of the world, the demand for water is no longer growing. In the United States, the total demand for water today is less than it was 30 years ago. And the per capita demand for water is much less than it was 30 years ago. And what's happening here is a change in the nature of our economy, and it's an improvement in the efficiency of water use, and it's the ability to grow more food with less water. And if there's any indication that we're in a transition from the second age of water to the third age of water, to true sustainability, I think this is evidence for that. It's evidence that we can do more and more with fewer and fewer resources, and with better management, and with better technology, and with better institutions, and with better economics. And that's the soft path for water, and I believe that's the third age of water. And I think the transition to the third age of water is coming. And I think all of us are part of it. And sometimes it's hard to see a transition when you're in the middle of it. We're used to doing things one way, and we're slowly beginning to do things another way. But I think the transition is inevitable, and I think it's going to be positive, and I encourage all of you to play a role in this transition to the third age of water. Thank you, and my best wishes for a successful Iwater conference, and I look forward to the conversations in the next few days.